worried. His orders are simple: march to Concord, seize a cache of rebel military stores, and be back in Boston before the colony even fully wakes up. Nobody in the column expects a battle. They are about to march 18 miles into the single most humiliating day of their professional lives, and they will spend most of it running. How does an army that wins the opening skirmish end that same day broken, bleeding, and chased back into its own barracks by farmers? By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was a colony under military occupation in everything but name. Gage's intelligence told him the largest of these caches sat in Concord, about 18 miles northwest of the city. London wanted decisive action. The man riding that word into the darkness was a 40-year-old Boston silversmith with a talent for showing up exactly where history needed him. Paul Revere had spent the better part of a year working inside a loose intelligence network of Boston patriots, men who watched British troop movements, tracked officers' habits, and built a system of lantern signals and mounted couriers specifically so that a night like this one wouldn't catch the countryside asleep. Revere wasn't a soldier. He was a craftsman, a former artillery officer in the French and Indian War, restless and precise, the kind of man who'd already ridden dispatches to New York and Philadelphia carrying news of earlier crises. On the night of April 18th, tipped off that Gage's troops were finally moving, Revere had 2 lanterns hung in Boston's Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, so the countryside would know the British were crossing the Charles River by boat, and then he climbed onto a borrowed horse named Brown Beauty and rode west into the dark to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and the militia companies along the road, that the regulars were coming. The decision that turned an errand into a catastrophe was made by men who never fired a shot. Gage's secrecy had already failed before Smith's column left Boston. Patriot riders, Revere, William Dawes taking a separate route, and later Dr. Samuel Prescott, who alone made it all the way to Concord after Revere and Dawes were stopped by a British patrol, spread the alarm town by town, church bell by church bell, so that by the time Smith, sensing the operation was compromised, made the call that would define the day. He sent a courier back to Boston requesting reinforcements, and pushed a 6-company advance force ahead under Major John Pitcairn to secure the 2 key bridges at Concord before the whole column arrived. It was a sound tactical decision. It was also far too late. The alarm was already 40 miles down the road by the time Pitcairn's men reached Lexington, 5 miles short of Concord, just as the first gray light of dawn came up over the green. Picture the scene on Lexington Green just before 5 in the morning. About 70 militiamen, under Captain John Parker, a 4 to 6-year-old farmer and French and Indian War veteran already sick with tuberculosis that would kill him within months, standing in loose formation in the half-light, watching several hundred British regulars come around the bend in the road with fixed bayonets. Parker, by every reliable account, had no intention of starting a war that morning. His later, famous instruction to his men, "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want a war, let it begin here," was defensive, not defiant. Pitcairn rode forward shouting for the rebels to disperse, to lay down their arms. Parker, outnumbered roughly 8 to 1, began ordering his own men to fall back. And then, from somewhere, no one to this day knows which side, which weapon, which man, a shot cracked across the green. What followed lasted less than a minute. British regulars, keyed up after a night march and a tense standoff, fired an uncontrolled volley into the retreating militia without waiting for orders. 8 Americans were killed on Lexington Green, 1 British soldier wounded. Pitcairn and his officers rode through the ranks trying to restore order, striking at their own men's muskets with their swords to stop the firing. It worked, eventually. Smith's main column arrived shortly after, and the combined force, now roughly 700 strong, marched onto Concord with drums beating, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. This is the part worth paying close attention to, because the 2 hours the British spent standing around in Concord are what turned a bad morning into a catastrophic afternoon, and it's worth subscribing now if you want the next video the moment we cover what happened at Concord's North Bridge in full detail, because that fight, and the 18 miles after it, is where this story actually turns. In Concord, the British search for military stores turned up disappointingly little. Most of the powder and cannon had already been moved or hidden in the days before, tipped off by the same intelligence network that had warned Revere. While companies searched houses and barns, roughly 4, Major John Buttrick gave the order to advance. At the bridge, British light infantry companies under Captain Walter Lawrie, badly outnumbered and caught reorganizing on the wrong side of the river, opened fire first this time. 2 militiamen died instantly. The Americans returned. Laurie's companies fell back in disorder. The main column, still searching the town, had no idea yet what that meant for the 18 miles ahead of them. Smith's column began its withdrawal from Concord around noon, and this is where the day stopped being a battle and became a slow-motion execution. The road back to Boston ran through a landscape the British had never had to fight in before, stone walls lining nearly every field, thick tree lines, narrow causeways through marsh, every mile offering 100 places for a man with a musket to hide, fire, and vanish before anyone could return the volley. By early afternoon, militia companies from towns the British hadn't even passed on the way out, Woburn, Billerica, Reading, Chelmsford, eventually numbering in the thousands by the day's end, were converging on the road home, taking up positions along what would become known, grimly, as the Gauntlet. At a sharp bend called Bloody Curve near Lexington, and again at Fisk Hill, and again over the next 12 miles, the British column absorbed fire from both flanks while trying to maintain any kind of marching order at all. Smith himself was shot in the thigh near Lexington and had to be helped onto a horse. Pitcairn was thrown from his own mount when it bolted, his ceremonial pistols left behind in the road, later recovered as trophies. By the time the shattered column staggered into Lexington around 2 in the afternoon, ammunition running low, men falling out from wounds and exhaustion, discipline had all but collapsed. Some soldiers, by British officers' own later accounts, ran. They were saved from total destruction by roughly 1,000 fresh troops and 2 cannon under Brigadier General Hugh Earl Percy, who had marched out from Boston earlier that day on Gage's orders and reached Lexington just in time to form a defensive square around Smith's broken command. Percy's artillery briefly scattered the pursuing militia, cannon fire being one thing Colonial companies had no answer for yet, but it did not get easier. The militia regrouped within the hour. The gauntlet resumed, mile after mile, all the way to Charlestown. By the time Percy's exhausted, bleeding column finally reached the safety of naval gun cover at Charlestown Neck around sunset, they had marched and fought across roughly 18 miles of hostile countryside in under 15 hours. The British suffered 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, 273 casualties out of a force that had left Boston that morning confident it would face no resistance at all. American losses came to 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing, a fraction of the British toll, inflicted almost entirely by farmers, tradesmen, and part-time soldiers who had never fought a European army in the open field in their lives, and had, correctly, chosen not to. The ripple from that single day reached farther than anyone in Boston or London could yet imagine. Within 24 hours, word of Lexington and Concord was spreading south by courier relay, reaching New York in 4 days and Philadelphia within a week, hardening colonial opinion that had still been genuinely divided about whether armed resistance was necessary. Within weeks, thousands of militiamen from across New England had marched to Boston and begun a siege of the city that would last nearly a year, penning Gage's army inside on a peninsula it no longer controlled beyond cannon range. The illusion the British army had carried into that march, that colonial militia would scatter the moment professional soldiers appeared, was gone, and it never fully came back, not at Bunker Hill 2 months later, not for the rest of the war. Britain had gone looking for a cache of gunpowder. It came home having proven, in front of the entire colony, that its army could be humiliated on an open road by men it had spent a decade dismissing as farmers with muskets. Paul Revere never completed his ride to Concord. He was captured by a British patrol outside Lexington and briefly detained, his horse confiscated, before being released to walk home on foot. He spent the rest of the war working as an officer, an industrialist, and eventually became far more famous in the 19th century, thanks to a Longfellow poem, than he ever was in his own lifetime for what he actually did that night. Captain John Parker, who stood his ground and lost 8 men on Lexington Green, died of tuberculosis 5 months later, in September 1775, never living to see whether the war he'd been forced into on his own town's green would end in independence. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith recovered from his wound, but his reputation never did, blamed by many in the British command for the delays and disorganization that turned the raid into a rout. he spent the rest of his career in largely undistinguished postings. Major John Pitcairn, who had genuinely tried to prevent the massacre at Lexington from spiraling further, was killed 2 months later at Bunker Hill, shot while leading a charge, reportedly dying in his own son's arms. Earl Percy, whose relief column arguably saved Smith's entire force from annihilation, went on to a respectable military and political career in Britain, eventually inheriting his father's dukedom, one of the few men from that road who walked away from April 19 with his reputation genuinely enhanced. General Thomas Gage, who had ordered a quiet raid specifically to avoid provoking exactly this kind of incident, was recalled to London within months, his career effectively ended by the war his own caution had failed to prevent. The British Army marched out that morning to seize gunpowder it barely found, and marched home having spent its own reputation instead. 18 miles, it turned out, was all it took. That road between Lexington and Concord is a paved parkway today, dotted with small stone markers where men fell, most drivers passing them at 40 miles an hour without a glance. If you want more stories like this one, the single days that quietly decided the shape of a war, subscribe and hit like, and tell me in the comments, do you think the shot at Lexington was fired by a nervous militiaman, a jumpy regular, or someone else entirely hiding in the crowd?